Greetings, future fossils. I don't think anyone alive right now would deny that we are living in bizarre times, but lately I've been feeling like the broken clock that's right twice a day. For my entire adult life, I've been preoccupied by the idea that we're living through an extraordinary moment. Different people have different words for this: the sixth mass extinction, the Anthropocene, the singularity, late capitalism. The diagnoses are as plural as the ostensible causes. I guess the point is, though, that I'm not unique, and there are a lot of people out there that regard what we're living through right now as the moment they've been training for, as the moment we've all intuited was coming. Of course, when you get into predictions and prophecies, it's easy to conflate timescales. So I think I spent most of the last 10 years imagining that the epochal events that would unfold over the course of my life were going to happen a lot more gradually than I thought they would the 10 years prior. It's a complex topic, made more complex by the fact that it's very difficult to know which way is up when you're caught in a riptide like the one we're in right now. All of this is to say that when I went back and uncasqued what I thought was a way overdue conversation with novelist and writing professor Alex Shakar, I recorded last August for Future Fossils, feeling the need to get his conversation out to you folks now, even though it may not be timely or relevant. Well, it turned out actually that the entire conversation was suffused with a strange, almost oracular significance. Alex's two novels, The Savage Girl and Luminarium, strike to the very heart of the deepest inquiries I think are capable of us as human beings, but they also do it in a way that speaks to the peculiar condition that we have here in the early 21st century, a sort of roiling, slow motion apocalypse, breakdown of consensus reality, a collective psychedelic experience that challenges everything we think we know. He's one of my favorite authors, and when I listened to this conversation again, I had a new understanding of why that is the case. His books embody, I believe, this paradoxical essence of our moment and what it is to be alive in it. The hope, the awe, the terror, the trauma, the humor, the possibility, the sheer creative splendor, the transcendence, the dread, and the confusion, and at the heart of it, the unresolved, potentially unresolvable mystery, luminous, ever-present, beckoning. It's a rare treat for me to get to speak to one of my favorite authors on this show. I'm really excited to share this with you, and I'm deeply grateful to everyone whose continued support allows me to even have these conversations in the first place, to make time for them. The financial, but possibly more importantly, the emotional support of the Future Fossils community, the sense that I'm on the right track, I'm doing the right thing with this show, has kept the light on here when in those moments of doubt, I questioned whether there really needed to be a lighthouse on this beach. These last 2 weeks especially, I've seen a surge in support, and so I really need to take a moment and thank all of the new contributors: Joshua Jackson, Casey O'Kane, Joshua Yeldon, Tim Mansfield, Veronica Robertson, Ahmed Kabil, Ben Hewitt, Casey Kripe, everyone who agrees that this show may be too weird to live, but is also too rare to die. Today, I finally launched the Future Fossils Discord server. Hopefully, I'll see you in there. We have a lovely scene in the Future Fossils Facebook group, but I wanted to give something a little bit more personal and community-oriented. A little cave from which we can watch the spectacular colors of the sunset of this age, or the sunrise of the next age. Which is it? I don't know. Let's find out. Thanks for listening, and thanks for letting me introduce you to the warmth, soul, wisdom, and humor of Alex Shakar. If you're stuck at home with time to read, I cannot more confidently recommend two novels for this strange moment than The Savage Girl and Luminarium. In the show notes, there's a link to my Amazon shop. Grab these books there, and you're helping me and Alex and yourself all at the same time. But, you know, I mean, what is identity anyway? And can you really change the world with a purchase? Yes, actually, if it changes you. Alex Shakar, it's a pleasure to get to speak to you on Future Fossils and at all. It's a real treat.
Thanks. Likewise. I'm happy to be here.
I gotta first of all, I have to pay my dues to Robert Gehorsam for introducing us, who is almost like a character from one of your books, right there, wheeling and dealing at the intersection of various futural things, and
definitely, he's a wonderful guy. Yeah.
So, this is going to be a tricky conversation because obviously I don't know who has read your books. I don't often have the opportunity to speak directly with the author about their work on the show, but I'm going to hope that what this does is mobilize my listenership to go read The Savage Girl and Luminarium, and to appreciate why these two books are two of my favorite novels. So,
well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to hear.
All right. So, first of all, how would you, if we started in orbit, we're doing the Google Earth VR, dive into specificity.
Got it.
This is the boring, generic question, but what got you into writing? How did you become a writer?
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I don't know. I mean, how far do you want me to go back?
Triassic period.
Yeah. Sure. I think. Well, I guess just sort of. I grew up. My dad's an actor, and so I was around the arts in a certain way, and I saw him playing the parts of playing different parts in different stories, and I think I considered doing that for a while, and then I wanted to. I think what appealed to me about writing was that I would have a little bit more control, or at least I at the time maybe that's what I thought, that I would have a little bit more control over creating not only just sort of being inhabiting the characters, creating the worlds in that kind of way. So. And then I had an influential teacher in high school who got me into really appreciating fictional worlds, I started reading more and more, and I think I decided at some point I think I was in high school, and I decided that I was going to be a writer, and I really hadn't. I don't think I knew what I was getting into then. I thought I was picturing a very different kind of lifestyle, I think, than what it ends up being. But I don't regret the decision. I think it's allowed me to, I inhabit these worlds that I write about for a long time because these books take me years to write. So it's what's one of the nice things is it's really fun to be able to go into a world like the world of the Savage Girl, which is exploring the world of these people who spot fashion trends and learn all about that and sort of learn all about the world that they're in and the world that I'm in, sort of connecting the two, and then emerge from that bubble and then dive into another one, and sort of novels are a learning experience for me, definitely. I don't know what I'm writing when I start out, really, or at least I have a theory about what I'm going to write, but it evolves. And it helps me evolve.
So that since you brought it up, I guess The Savage Girl is a good place to start. This book, even though it takes place, it was 2001, right? It takes place before smartphones and tablets and social media in the kind of contemporary sense, but it does feel to speak to, even now in 2019, so many very pressing contemporary issues. You know, like you seem to be like charting the creode, even though there's like, you know, inevitability and contingency in evolution, whether biological or cultural. And even though you can't necessarily, you, the generic you, can't necessarily tell the specific forms it will take, it's like you can see the landscape. And I admire both of these works for seeing the basin of possibilities into which culture is being channeled by history. So I'm really curious. You said you don't come into this with an idea of what you're writing, but how did the decision of The Savage Girl, which, you know, to set this out, is a story in which this trend spotter finds a woman, like a teenage girl living in the city, like a primitive, like a hunter-gatherer wearing animal pelts and hunting pigeons, and then deciding, ironically or post-ironically, put a pin in that, to offer this up as the image for an ad campaign. So like how did this world develop for you in the course of writing, or what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, well, the Savage Girl ended up, you know, I mean, the story is about a woman who moves to this kind of fictional city. It's called Middle City. It's a big American metropolis, and it happens to be built on a semi-active volcano. And she's going to the city to take care of her sister Ivy, and Ivy is a fashion model, sort of a young fashion model who's recently had a meltdown and has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And Ursula ends up connecting with Ivy's boyfriend, Chaz, who runs a trend spotting firm. And then so she gets pulled into this world of trend spotting, of finding the future, as Chaz calls it. And then you know, as you sort of told, she finds this girl in the park and is kind of infatuated with the idea of this, you know, so this kind of primitivity that she's seeing in this girl in the park, and that becomes the basis for an ad campaign, and then things get increasingly out of control from there. So I started out, I mean, the book started out. I was living in Austin, Texas at the time. It started out set in Austin, Texas. And the trend spotters were a bunch of people sitting around smoking cigarettes and talking a lot. And the story didn't go anywhere. So it took me a while to find out what the story was. And Ursula, who's the main character in, you know, started out as being just sort of a minor character. But what I was interested in, I think, and what I got increasingly interested in, and it wasn't until I think, you know, the second big rewrite of the book that I started seeing what the book was about for me, and that was this link between this, you know, sort of the idea of schizophrenia, if not like sort of the literal medical definition of it, this sort of cognitive dissonance and delusion on the one hand, and consumerism on the other hand, and how those two things were, you know, kind of working together, and in our culture at the time. And so from there, that allowed me to explore a lot of interesting, you know, sort of things that these trend spotters predict and get into. You know, you mentioned post-irony, like, so this is the big trend that. So there are these idealistic trend spotters like Javier, who believes that that post-irony is going to be this great new, you know, kind of new earnestness where we're gonna really discover who we are, and we're gonna use products to kind of self-create. And there are more cynical, you know, people like Chaz, as you find out, who, you know, for him, post-irony is this kind of cognitive dissonance wherein he has this theory about paradescence, you know, like he takes Ursula through the supermarket, and they see that he tells her that every product has this broken soul, you know. So like coffee, any successful ad campaign for coffee will get you both to want the stimulation and the relaxation that that this amazing magical beverage offers. So that gets lodged in Ursula's mind, and so I think ultimately the book is getting at sort of the paradessence of our society and of capitalism and of all that stuff. So. Maybe I'll just stop talking, and I could talk more about any one of those things. But that's sort of how the project evolved.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I really wanted to bring up paradescence because I feel like this is one of the most useful small nuggets that is going to get like picked up by a virus and implanted in other ideas. Like the paradoxical essence. I love the examples that you give in this book. Although you don't call out Nike specifically, you do bring up the fact that, these are shoes which are about gripping the earth, but at the same time, it's supposed to offer this transcendence through the winged foot, the logo. Right, You've got air travel, which is both exotic and familiar, comfortable and adventurous. Mm-hmm. And there is something in that hold, that I've often thought about this in terms of a paradox not being like a firm category of things, but being not ontological, but epistemological, right? Like it's not a thing, really. It has to do with our relationship to phenomena and the dissonance of our era and stretching back decades is in between the way that we have become aware of our role as consumers. I think in a way it's sort of a contemporary version, to weave prehistory into this, to the kind of cognitive dissonance that must have happened for early humans when we had to reconcile the fact that we were killing other animals for food, and like this sort of the condition around which we began worshiping the bison or the cave bear or whatever, worshiping these things in their power, even though we were opposed in some way to them. And I don't know. So there's that thing, and, paradox as being a thing that is resolved by taking an additional perspective. And then also the condition of the schizophrenic as often, not always, but often paranoid. And Ivy's rants in this book about how she feels as though every move that she makes she's responsible for like the currents and the flows through the world, seems to speak a lot to something that wasn't, I don't think, quite as pervasive or horrible when you were writing this book, but definitely is now, which is this understanding that we live in this media environment where we are in a kind of a paranoid way exposed to our implications in all of these global webs of supply chains. And, like the way that the burning of the Amazon rainforests these last couple weeks has just torn people apart on, as I've been watching social media, what are the right actions that I take in order to prevent this? If I'm in Kansas or whatever, what finger do I have to twitch? What food do I have to stop buying to intervene in this?
Yeah. I mean, it's great to hear you getting that out of it. Yeah, Ivy has these delusions of reference, and I think that is something that she says these lines like, "I am the drain magnet and the glamour continuum," and it felt right for me at the time, and all this was very new at the time that I was writing it. But she does like get on a this sort of camera on the web where she's being filmed all the time, and she's telling people to send her money, and she's setting the money on fire. And it's interesting that you mentioned the rainforest too, because the book does take us there too. One of the things that I was really interested in is sort of, does this consumer culture that we're in give us power, or does it take it away? And that was sort of, for me, I think there's kind of a central koan for me at the center of each book that I write, and for me maybe that was the thing that I was exploring, the ways that this the society we're in is so dynamic and so expansive, and so allowing us all these new powers. We have connecting, and at the same time we are feeling like, as you're pointing out with what do I do? How do I stop this awful thing from happening, we see so much of it right now, and we see our own powerlessness too. And right around the time that, the Savage Girl came out a week after 9/11, and suddenly, boom, like everything was different. It was very, very weird in that cultural commentators were getting on the air and saying, the age of irony is over, and so we were suddenly like in this strange way, like in this kind of post-ironic, or people were proclaiming that we were. I don't think we really were, but irony was kind of going underground again. And a few days later, there were GM commercials telling us to buy American, basically, and to keep the economy going. And the mayor and the president were all sort of getting on the air and telling us this was our power. This was how we could help, was by sort of redirecting our urge to be citizens into our role as consumers.
I have to bring up the documentary Century of the Self, Adam Curtis. Have you seen this?
Oh, wow. No, I really like that guy, though. I should check that out.
It is a superb look at how over the latter half of the 20th century, advertising changed from being about the product to being about the consumer. It's in a way, it's like a prequel to the Savage Girl, or it's setting the stage for the kind of questions that you're asking. The whole point being that lifestyle consumerism became, sometime in the 70s and 80s, a way for people to express themselves amidst this sort of growing cognitive dissonance. And that was, again, like what you're talking about, like it is the consumer decision through which vote with your dollar.
Right.
And there are both sort of cynical and hopeful ways of looking at that. But, I don't know if have you heard of like metamodernism?
I've never heard that term.
Okay,
no.
So Shia LaBeouf is one of the sort of more celebrity figures involved in this sort of a philosophical movement to reconcile the ironic and the sincere. I mean, there's a number of different forms of metamodernism that have emerged from different areas of society, but the one that I find really fascinating is this attempt to try and square the circle and to acknowledge that our times call for, that their absolute relativism no longer works, that hipster detachment is no longer a universally sufficient strategy, and that there's a kind of, much as I think as we moved out of the world of religion into the world of science, if we can talk about it in that way, that this creeping renaissance that's been taking place over the last few centuries, and how that, like Robert Keegan at Harvard talks about that as a movement from operating within one value system from inside and identifying with the role that you take. And as we move into the modern, then it's about authoring your own value system and then being able to move from role to role fluidly through the world. And then it seems like what's going on now is a similar turn into understanding how these different value systems live in some sort of ecological balance, and how they, in a similar way, like the value systems themselves are fashions that you might adopt to suit a particular context. And so, we see this, maybe I'm getting way off the rail with this book, but like, we see this a lot in the way that reality has become, as Eric Davis would say, an operationalized fiction, where this sort of consumer mentality has manifested itself politically in terms of which reality you want to buy and enact. And
this elective affinities. I want to go back to what you were saying about, your description of metamodernism, which I'll have to look that up. I toward the end of the Savage Girl, where I do go into the rainforest and we sort of meet these European neo-primitives who are living there, and there's a scheme to sort of quote unquote save the rainforest by collecting all its genomes, basically, and saving them in bottles. While Ursula is there, she starts thinking about the possibility of an ironic religion. And so that sort of, and to me, it's kind of, there's a sort of basically post-irony, as the novel kind of was getting at it, is this thing that kind of piths or, suspends the dialectic that's going on between irony and earnestness into this state of kind of schizophrenia. But beyond that, maybe there's this possibility of an ironic religion. And that was like the holy grail of 19th century philosophers like Schlegel. Western civilization's needs for intellectual freedom on the one hand, and this kind of morally principled society on the other. And so there's a sense where maybe where we're going, with consumerism. Well, is that part of this new ironic religion? Is there some way that we can take all this and use it? So I wanted to go on and talk about the second part of what you were saying, but maybe remind me a little bit. And you were sort of talking about people choosing where they wanted to, choosing the operationalizing reality.
Yeah, I don't know. There is something about this seemingly irresolvable balance between the true and the constructed, and it makes sense that as like a postmodern philosophy matures, that we reach a point where we realize that we're living in a kind of, each of us, a kind of virtual reality. Like we know, and this is, I'm going to try and bridge to Luminarium here, because there is this, the more we learn about neuroscience, the more we learn about the fallibility of the human mind and the historicity of human perception and experience, and the way that it's all bound within an evolutionary and a psychological biography, in a sense. And so everything from like the way that we perceive the difference between two colors, like the basic optical illusions, to the ways that that our attention can be manipulated by marketers or by, retail or political, that we are unreliable narrators. So once we we're like stumbling through the valley of the shadow of death, where there's this absolutist adherence to relativism, but then there are things that are like, while not ubiquitous, are common, while not universal, are essentially normal to the human experience. And as we widen our understanding of intelligence, we learn to see things from other ways. There's this tightrope that we have to walk. And I think this is the sincere and ironic thing here. Like the new earnestness, to borrow that phrase from the Savage Girl, is an earnestness that also has its tongue like firmly planted in its cheek, that is provisional. It's like a phase change has happened here into being willing to move, from earnest position into a new earnest position. It's like we've scraped ourselves off the sidewalk a little bit, and we're blowing down the street. And you handle this so beautifully in Luminarium, which I read first, which is, I'll let you introduce it, but one of the things that's handled so beautifully in this book is the question of virtual reality, and its relationship to the broader sort of social machine. And then one of them is neurotheology and the what it means to our understanding of the self and the mind and of religion, given that we are capable of triggering these religious experiences or non-dual type experiences with magnets, basically, and electricity. And both of these books are talking a lot about the permeability of a postmodern subject, and the multiplicity of that subject, or the plurality. And I feel like both of them are training a kind of a stereoscopic view on the challenges of navigating this kind of a world in any kind of, like finding any kind of solid ground or stable footing.
Yeah. I do think that it's funny. Only in retrospect, I really see Luminarium kind of as a continuation of the Savage Girl, in that I think taking that question about ironic religion and then putting it into this other context was really looking at virtuality in a lot of different ways in the book, and and about whether sort of technology has this. It seems to have this twin potential, like to either to make us more whole, or to trap us in further entrap us in bubbles and in divides from each other, and to isolate us. So just to go into the story a little bit first, just so that people know what we're talking about a little bit. Luminarium is about, well, all right, so there's this guy, Fred Brunian, and his life is falling apart. His software company, which he's built from the ground up, is basically being stolen from him by this, by this unequal partnership that he got them into. And his brother, his twin brother, is dying in a hospital. He's in a coma from cancer, and his fiancée has left him, and there are all these things going wrong in his life, and they're starting to open up new kinds of questions for him. And he sees this attractive woman putting up a flyer on the wall of the hospital, and it's for a scientific study. And he goes and checks it out, and she puts a helmet on his head. Oh, and Fred's also getting these mysterious messages. He started getting these messages apparently from his twin brother, who's in a coma, and he thinks he's being trolled. He doesn't know what's going on. And so he goes into this study, and this woman puts like a sparkly gold motorcycle helmet on his head, and it's got all these wires coming out of it, and he doesn't really know what to expect. And the first thing he knows is he's seeping out of his, like he's expanding and becoming one with the chair that he's sitting in, and one with the wires, and one with the helmet, and the whole room. And the feeling doesn't quite go away, when he goes out into this debriefing with the experimenter, and he's feeling at one with her, even as she's explaining what they've done to him, like sort of the little trick they've played on him neurologically. And so he doesn't know what to do with this. He's got this overwhelming kind of effusive, he's falling in love. I mean, but that's just, the start of it. And then it's still not going away. And he walks outside, and all kinds of crazy things happen to him after that. And so the story takes Fred through all kinds of adventures, but the backbone of it is that every week he goes back into this study, and they do something different to him. They create yet another sort of spiritual, like a experience that we normally associate with spirituality, but they do it, and then she explains to him exactly how they did it. In terms of like the parts of his brain that they've messed with. So he has to reconcile. As his life is falling apart, and as he's struggling to get his company back, and as he's struggling to get, and as dealing with his being in love with this woman, he has to kind of make sense of his materialist kind of understanding of the world and this other thing that's blossoming in him, and increasingly doing so. So that storyline, is what I think allowed me to get at these questions of whether technology is something that's going to, because there are all kinds of. I guess that your question was about virtuality, and I didn't quite go into that. Maybe I'll. His company is originally, sort of before the big traumatic event happens to our society. This is in the run-up. This is in the .com era. His company is this utopian kind of virtual world for children that he and his brothers are creating. And then after 9/11, the program funding dries up, and all the programmers are chasing the war dollars down to the Orlando area, which is where the combination of military contractors and Pixar programmers and military bases are creating this thing called that programmers are calling the military entertainment complex. And so his company goes in a very different direction after that. And so, and a lot of the novel actually takes place in virtual reality. There are scenes where he and his younger brother are basically in the simulations that they're creating. So I was able to explore with this story, like a lot of the questions about virtuality and about the ways that we're hoping that it'll give us new kinds of consciousness, new kinds of freedom, new kinds of insights, and the ways that it's, and the ways that maybe we're just sort of recreating the same thing over and over again, and we're stuck in this loop.
Definitely. This may seem like a tangent, but I just want to nod to the fact that you originally set the Savage Girl in Austin, which is in fact built on top of a dormant volcano. Like a Cretaceous seaway volcano, at the Blund Creek Preserve. I watched the 2014 lunar eclipse from the lip of that volcano just north of St. Edward's University. And,
that's beautiful.
And there's something about both of these books. I think we can do the Hail Mary pass and bring this all together here, in which the presence of what like Hakim Bey called ontological anarchy, saying that the empire was never founded, that it's an assertion of human will against the indomitable chaos of the real, and that the fact that we built the city on the volcano, I think, and the emphasis to the way that at least some, although civilization may consider them crazy, some navigate urban spaces as though they were living in the wilderness already, which in fact they are. That there is something really key to understanding these concerns about how about enclosure and about the way that we continue to ensorcell ourselves into these complex economic structures. The military entertainment complex, for what it's worth, is a term that I was introduced to from historian William Irwin Thompson in his, I think it was like a 1972 or 4 book, Evil and World Order, where he's talking about exactly this thing. He's sort of predicting that the promise of electronic emancipation was already being, the pig was getting the meat map drawn on its body already in the 60s and 70s. And
that's really interesting. I mean, when I first heard that just from programmers who were going through this in the post 9/11 years, and the term just set off a light bulb. It's like, oh, wait a minute, there's something really interesting there. And then when I went down to research that area, so the novel takes place in New York City, which is one kind of organism, and I want to talk more about that too. By the way, that point you brought up about cities, and then he goes down to the Orlando area, and Orlando is this really interesting place. There are all kinds of sort of manufactured little societies there. He spends a while in Celebration, Florida, which is this town built by Disney with this kind of utopian plan. And some aspects of the city are neat in that like he wanted rich people and middle class people, there are no poor people there, to live side by side, connected through the alleys, and the streets are kind of power washed and every morning, but there are also all these kind of draconian laws about what the color of your white picket fence has to be white, and it has to be a picket, and so on and so forth. And Muzak just sort of comes out of the speakers of the downtown, basically comes out of the trees. And then there's like places like the Holy Land Experience and like Universal Studios theme park. And so, there are all these kind of like little utopian, dystopian worlds, and then there's the industrial park itself that our mission is a part of. So yeah, I mean, there are all these kind of, in a way, there are all these sort of virtual realities that are all over the landscape in physical form. But going back to what you were saying about cities, I think that a traumatic event. So I think you're right that we're always trying to cocoon ourselves in some kind of meanings, and that a traumatic event like the tallest buildings in a city being, decimated by plane strikes. I was really interested in. I set the novel years after it. the novel kind of comes at 9/11 from all these different angles, and you don't really know that that's where it's going kind of as you're reading, but it gets more and more clear that all these things that are happening, like the course of Fred's life, what's happened to his brother, what Mira is going through, Fred's parents and their own sort of mourning. His mother is a Reiki healer who responded to 9/11, police and firemen by going and laying her hands on them in the relief tents. And now she's like going around trying to heal the city, she and her group of Reiki healers. So, but there's this way that a traumatic event like that it creates a hole in that little safe kind of complex of understandings that we've created. It's this radical meaninglessness that just gets punched into the center of our society. And so and that's what I think happened on a global scale, with an event like that, but, particularly in the city. And there's a scene in the novel in which, after Fred has gone through a whole lot of different stuff and he's sort of circumnavigating the crater along with all these other people. And that was really the image that I think was at the center of the book for me, which is that this kind of traumatic event is like the black hole at the center of a galaxy, and it itself is just this utter absence of meaning in this. And it's not only an absence of meaning, it's sucking all the meaning into it. And we've got to reshape ourselves around it. And that's how we respond, is by creating new meaning, and there's a sense in which we are always reacting, but there's also a way in which those kinds of cataclysmic events offer us opportunities, and maybe this is the only good thing about them, that they offer us an opportunity to see ourselves in a slightly different and maybe more realistic way, and that they allow ourselves to journey inward if we use that opportunity, and to understand our own natures in a different way.
Yeah, it's something that you just connected for me, because it's been a couple of years since I read this book, but you brought up earlier the delusion of reference with Ivy's schizophrenia and the Savage Girl, and how Fred's mom has this like cluster of people doing Reiki on New York. And in the meaning black hole of this kind of a trauma, it reminds me, and this comes up on the show a lot, and I think for good reason, that we're in a kind of interregnum as a species here between one meaning framework and another that it hasn't really made itself too clear yet, which is a lot like how a tree will like fall in the forest and suddenly all of this light will reach the floor of the forest, and the established order has been broken, and the saplings rush they compete to fill that gap. And in doing so, the wood of those trees is different from the wood of these other trees. It's curlier. It's because they are racing to fill that gap. It's a weird wood. It's not straight. Like, it's literally, it seems as though there's a really clear analogy between that kind of a phenomenon and the way that if you induce a toxic shock to a bacterial culture, that it increases the rate of mutation in that culture. And in what seems to be an attempt to, like a flailing around to try and find a solution to this thing, and that there is a relationship between trauma and creativity, and between a sort of, as people talk about, like, weird is the new normal. And there's so much more conversation around neurodiversity and the benefits of neurodiversity from the level of the system, that one of the consequences of 9/11 seems to have been, in a way, to sensitize us to the freaks, to make it okay for us to, to not have, it makes it harder for us to just factor out all of these things, because suddenly they're potentially vital evolutionary strategies for us to find a way to make meaning in this void.
That's interesting. I like the metaphor that we're all weird wood these days. I think that's true. In that book, there are also all these sort of utopian ways and dystopian ways that we're trying to evolve in response to it. And I don't know if this is exactly what you were saying, but one other thing I wanted to say about the military industrial entertainment complex is I saw that as a kind of weird wood, that was forming, and I saw the all the sort of neurotheological stuff as weird wood, that's forming in the culture, and these two things are, I guess I was sort of placing them in opposition to each other a little bit, in terms of responses to developments that have been happening, both in and threats. And with the military entertainment complex, that's something that became like a little bit of a koan for me. What is that? How big does it get? How extensive? How universal is it in terms of like how many of our entertainments are military in nature? And how much of our militarism is entertainment, and so and the bigger that got, and I think it gets big for Fred in the book, but then there's also a way in which it ultimately kind of becomes a metaphor for the self and the ego, and the way that the ego is always on this war footing. It wants to eradicate otherness or keep it away, keep it at bay. It wants to wall itself off from it. It wants to expand its own interests. It's always kind of looking out for number one. And so the helmet and the sort of neurotheological stuff is taking Fred, is making him start to confront the possibility of an end to, like, what would the end to that look like? What would an end to military entertainment look like, not only outside but inside? And a way of I think that we're in this really strange moment now where you use the word ensorcelled, which is great. I think it's true. Like, we're being sucked into all these bubbles, and we are kind of being. There are ways that, whether it's like hikikomori, or is that the word, like people who are just playing video games all day long every day, and at the same time there are all these new invitations to interconnection, but it does that interconnection, that interconnection can be used to sort of really open things up, or it can be used to just reinforce your comfortable idea of who you are. And it's interesting to me the way that the world it's just kind of like this electromagnetic resonance that's just increasing both of these sorts of possibilities. It's putting everything on steroids. There's a lot of weird wood.
Definitely, yeah. If we were to like take all of the threads of this conversation around the planet and tie them on top, that knot looks something like this question about like what you just brought up, the nature of the self, because I'm really fond of, to bring up Eric Davis again, he cultural critic who's written a lot on reanimism, where he sees the way that the World Wide Web, whether it's AI assistants or whether it's scam bots or malware running online, or whether it's people catfishing each other, or whether it's, there's like all of these different forms where the machinery of our world has become lively enough to be mistaken for one of us. And at the same time, like on the opposite side of the Möbius strip, the self has been resolved as a mechanical production, as this thing that's a process of information and energy and matter. on the one hand, what this means is that we have this cognitive bias toward projecting agency into our environment, in order to protect the self. The classic example is the whisper in the grass. It's better to believe it's a tiger, and so that's the military industrial side of it. But then it's in the sense that any profound truth, the opposite of which is an equally profound truth, there is this thing about how, well, if that's the case, if everything is out to get you, then it's equally the case that I don't exist. That like I am, just like all of these other things, implicated in this sort of automatic web of being. There's something in both of these books about, again, like the city, the wilderness in the city, about the real within the virtual, that speaks to this promise, this possibility of transcending these paradoxes and this cognitive dissonance through an embrace of both sides of this polarity. And that, like a beautiful example of this is the prayer code that Fred runs in this, like inspired by prayer wheels, and how like you can just mechanize this thing. I don't know.
I'll just tell people what you're talking about. Like, so just kind of, I guess, as a birthday gift, back in the 90s, his brother got him this Cray YMP, like early generation supercomputer, which the two of them just assembled and never found a use for. It's just a giant hunk of metal that basically, like a couple of personal computers could basically handle the work of. And at some point, he writes a few lines of code just to make it pray continually over and over again in a kind of loop, and he calls it the prayerizer. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you were linking that into.
I mean, just that, like, as soon as we've stepped beyond the comfort zone into this weird ontology where
so
I'm a machine and the robots are agents.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's a lot of ways in which we are, sort of given more agency now, or seemingly, and there are also a lot of ways that we are being called upon to, that we're being sucked into these ways of objectifying ourselves. I really like the way that Jaron Lanier kind of put this when he talked about how the ways that we are presenting ourselves on social media and are these ways of kind of reducing ourselves and objectifying ourselves, and making ourselves kind of this into this sort of readable and usable code for, and that we are, I was going to say overlords, but it's what we, but what we're projecting onto this, that we want it to be. We want it to be the God. We want it to be the thing that has agency over us, and we're hoping that it's going to save us, and ultimately, all of this stuff. I mean, if you look at it from another point of view, all of this stuff is just our imaginations. I mean, it's ultimately just us.
But then, who's us? Us becomes a much broader thing. Once you let in the self-reproducing code and the octopus intelligence and the wood wide web, making it sort of altruistic economic decisions, and I think ultimately what I get out of your books is a lot like what I got out of this. This may seem bizarre and possibly even rude. I apologize for comparing you to other authors, but like, it reminds me a lot of what I got out of the writing of Tom Robbins, in his enchantment and his play in the possibility and in his reach into the depth of things. But where Tom, who also incidentally apparently starts his books without any idea of how they will go and writes them one word at a time. It kind of blows my mind. Allowing, and in that sense, allows the story to tell itself through him, which again sort of interrogates the agency of the of the author in the kind of modern sense, that we're not actually solely responsible for
Oh yeah.
for the novel. The novel writes itself through, like, with the hand and the brain of a person. But what Tom doesn't do, that I really admire in your work, is this unflinching look at the paradescence of reality, the dark, bright, or the numinous quality of these things, which is so on display even in the title of Luminarium. This notion that what we're really after isn't to be found in, it feels like a lot of authors that want to play in this space of, the enchanted banal, or the synchronicity of things, or strange correlations, the web works of meaning, and then, holes punched in those web works, are all too happy to just be like, and it's all cosmically profound, da 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 da, and not like sit there in what you rightly acknowledged as the koan of these things.
So, thank you. That's nice to hear. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I start out, kind of with a couple of seeds, and with but ultimately, like, it took me, like, Luminarium, it took me several years to write, and the first three or so years of that, I was, I realized that what I was doing was I was writing a book, that dealt with these questions of materialism and spirituality, and it took me that long to kind of realize that I didn't know what spirituality was, like, because I think everybody thinks they know, like they think, oh, like, it's like you believe X or Y, like you have an opinion about something, But there's so many ways in which it's the opposite of that, and so it was, I don't know how relevant this is to the discussion, but, you sort of asked about my process and how I discovered things. And so yeah, I at a certain point, I said, okay, like, I can't go on writing this until I know the answer to this question. And so I went to a Zendo, and I just was like, okay, so what is this about? And what's the meaning of life and everything like that? And it's, oh, well, maybe first you could learn how to sit and how to breathe. and so there are all these ways in which there's a lot of sort of spiritual things that, like the Reiki healing, and Fred gets into Zen too, and ways in which there are humorous sort of elements to all of that. But there's also, like, kind of a deeply earnest search. Zen is something I still, it's still very central to me, years and years later. And it was the way for me to put on that helmet and work with. There's also a lot of humor in Zen too, and in the writings of Zen. They say, well, this is it's beyond words and letters, but there's all this writing within Zen, which is great, and that you get more and more into and deeper into it, as you practice it. But so I guess this is a long way of saying that these things, that they are helping me to evolve, and I have to. A novel, I think, is like my karma, like I'm sort of dealing with all this stuff, and I have to, kind of figure out how to help it along, and it helps me along. And I hope that that's the reading experience too, that people will encounter these books, at useful moments in their own lives, and that it'll further their own investigations. But I think that art gives us a space for contemplation. I mean, there are moments, like if you get into meditation, or if you get into sort of what's at the core of these religions, you find that the neurologists and the spiritual practitioners are pretty much in agreement that the self is a virtual reality, in itself, and that there's actually a way to experience, whether it's for a moment or whether it's for an extended period of time, what it is for that barrier to come down. And I hope that art, gives us a space for that contemplation so that we can see more clearly like who we are and who we're becoming. And yeah, I mean, I was going to say one other thing, like that, where things are happening really fast now, like I think as you pointed out, and art is I think a way, sort of like meditation, art is a way for us to just for the space in which we're reading it to gain this kind of superpower where we can see the things coming at us and have a little time to and a little distance from it to be able to to sort of be with the characters and consider like, oh, would I react like that in this situation? And maybe that helps us to react a little bit differently in our lives and be a little bit more proactive.
I can't believe we made it this far into the conversation without addressing the fact that both of these books are like painfully funny. And that, there is this sense, that the in Zen where it's like, if you're not laughing, you don't get the joke. And so, for both of these works to so skillfully thread the eye of the needle where you're addressing, such difficult and dark topics in a way that's not even really like necessarily or exclusively dark humor, but is really just humorous and draws to light the ludicrousness of our lives. Like we didn't even get into this, but like while Fred's dealing with this essentially kind of hostile takeover with his company, he's helping his dad by working as a birthday clown. And like that is a very Zen kind of a move there. So I normally I would end this show with what now seems to me to be kind of a foolishly serious consideration where I say, okay, like let's assume we live our lives in light of the future, the unborn, that we pull our heads out of the street level view that we take of things. We acknowledge that there's this bigger framing in which we are the ancestors of someone. And what does that mean for our lives? And, usually I'll say, okay, well, do you have a message? Do you hope that your life is a message to those people? But I offer you a choice here, whether that seems like the appropriate question or whether the more appropriate question would be, if you had a joke to tell the unborn future, something that, you might be lost on them. You had to be there. What would it be?
Oh, man. I hope that I'm not the joke. I mean, I suspect that in some ways, inevitably, we are going to be that, and I actually hope that they look back on us and with a little bit of amusement. That would be a nice development because that would mean that they're a little bit that they're in a place where they can see all the ways that we were sort of searching and not quite finding, but maybe almost kind of forward. So that's maybe that's a good way to look at ourselves. With a little bit of humor and with also with a little bit of compassion. Maybe the question is, how do we want them to be looking? To be looking at us, and maybe right now that's my answer. I think with humorous compassion.
I'll take it, and that feels like a good place to wrap it. Thank you, Alex. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
It's been great fun. Yeah. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I've been getting into your podcast, and it's super interesting. You're always very, very illuminating, and so are your guests. So this has been a real pleasure for me in a lot of ways.
Thanks. Well, so I just found out that I've been invited to the Amazon influencer program. So
fantastic.
I'll be able to put up a storefront of all the books that I like and that I want people reading, and I'll be sure to put your books up there.
Influence away.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
that's wonderful.
All right. Thanks again for listening to Future Fossils. If you want to help kindle the flame of these conversations in the world, trip on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield and become a regular supporter. Or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Or just share with your friends. All of those things help. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, You can reach out to me directly, futurefossilspodcast@gmail.com. Until next time.